Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm delighted to be talking to David Davis this evening. David has served as Shadow Home Secretary from 2003 to 2008 and as Secretary of State for exiting the European Union from 2016 to 2018. He has also served as Chairman of the Conservative Party and as Chairman of the Public Accounts Committee. We'll be having a fairly wide-ranging discussion broken down into three parts. The first covering the expansion of state power during the pandemic, the second focusing on international relations, and the last on the Conservative Party and their post-pandemic ideological underpinnings. So, David, to start things off, I would like to ask you about what has, or rather has not, just happened, Freedom Day. Do you think that the delay is justified? And if it was justified, do you think we are then justified on reopening on July the 19th, given the current rise in case rate?
Well, let's start with, was it justified? The answer is no. I mean, there was an arguable case for extending the lockdown by 1 week because we were seeing an uptick in infections, but we were not really seeing much of an uptick either in hospitalizations or in deaths. But the trouble is, there's about a 2 week delay between each of those measures. And to be reasonably sure of the death rates, it would have been arguably worthwhile extending by 1 week, but not by a month. In fact, I told Matt Hancock that when I talked to him about a week ago. And of course, what I didn't know at the time was the data on the effectiveness of the two principal vaccines we use. Now, it may not sound by much, but increasing the assumed effectiveness of the vaccines from 86, 87% in preventing hospitalizations up to 91 to 96% actually has a huge impact. I mean, like it divides by 5 or 10 times the levels of deaths expected in the course of a year. And so I would have said there was really no argument for going into July, number one. And there are lots of other arguments which float around that. We're coming into summer. This is a massively seasonal disease. If you catch it in summer, even without the vaccine, it's safer than catching it in winter because the viral loads are lower, because your immune system is better. You're out in the sunshine. You've got lower density of virus around you. You are better. You're healthier. All those things mean that actually, frankly, infection in the summer for young healthy people is a low risk exercise, and actually, frankly, gives them immunity thereafter. So we might actually be trading infection now for infections in September, October, when it's more serious. So on all those counts, and that's before we even talk about the economy, it was a wrong decision.
So in that case, I'd have to ask you, why do you think the decision was made if there seems to be such a resounding case against it?
Well, I mean, partly, this is the Adam Smith Institute. You know about incentives, yeah, and or you should. And the truth is that many of the advisors have a one-way incentive pattern. They would think they would be punished if they underestimated the death rate and underestimated disease, but there's no downside for them personally if they overestimate it. So the tendency is to be ultra cautious. They don't carry the can for the economy. They don't carry the political can for people getting cross about this. We do that, and that's what ministers are there for. Who was it? It was Norman Fowler, I think, who said, advisors advise and ministers decide. Well, that's how it should be. One of the troubles through this whole COVID period has been that actually it's almost been that advisors decide. And that's probably because in the beginning, the conventional wisdom at least says we were too late into lockdown and that cost lives. To this day, I don't know if it's true or not, but that was the conventional wisdom. And so that's what's driven everything since. And there are undoubtedly in the Quad, in the form of Matt Hancock and Michael Gove, people who are aggressively aggressively cautious. That's a strange combination of words, but
I understand.
You know what I mean.
Yes.
And they've won the day over I think Boris's and Rishi Sunak's instincts. Anyway.
Oh, so I was going to ask you about that, because it seems there's a bit of a contrast between the approach this year, which seems far more cautious than what we had sort of around this time last year, especially around sort of September, October, November, when we had the period, we had the 1 month lockdown, and then we came out again. It seemed to be based on a slightly more risk prone, shall we say, approach than now, which seems perhaps slightly too risk averse.
Yeah, I think. Indeed, I might be partly at fault for this, because I said to Boris at some point, look, when we come out, we've got to stay out. This has got to be a one-way trip. And he started saying after that, it's got to be irreversible, which is the same thing. And I think that's important, because, if you're a small company and you are not sure that we're coming out forever, as it were, then would you call your staff back? Would you end furlough? Would you open up? Would you buy in stock? Probably not. You ain't going to do that when you're sure it's all going to start for real. And so it's incredibly important that when we do come out of this, it is forever, that we don't go back in at all. And so there may be a bit of caution of that nature as well. In play here, but I think it's gone too far. I mean, the truth is we should be opening up now, and I mean, I think to be honest, I think all the risks are in the same direction. I think actually the disease risks are not worsened by opening up now, and the economic risks clearly are worsened by staying locked down.
So to round this section out, then, do you think come July 19th we're out and we're out for good, or do you think that there's a chance that some restrictions might be maintained, or that we might in fact go back into some form of milder lockdown?
We ought to be out for good. I mean, the condition to deliver that is something which I've been expecting for some time. Indeed, I talked to Matt Hancock about it, and that is, I mean, I'd like to see us doing 1 million jabs a day in terms of the vaccination program. What's stopping that? I don't know. Whether it's the sort of physical ability to do it, or whether it's the supply of the vaccine, or whether it's a take-up, I don't know. But the reason I say that is, let's imagine a worse circumstance. Let's imagine you get to mid-September. Mid-September is the point of inflection. It's when infections start going up again because of the seasonal effects. Now, let's imagine you get to mid-September and suddenly there's a gamma variant. We've had alpha, beta, delta, whatever, and there's suddenly a gamma variant. We need to be able to very rapidly indeed revaccinate all the vulnerable groups. That's the way you avoid going in again. And if the gamma variant manages at least partially evade the vaccine. It's very, very hard. I mean, there's a lot of ignorance in terms of the commentators on this. It's very, very hard for a coronavirus of this class to completely avoid the vaccine, because there are about a minimum of about 18 attack points, and so to change all 18 is quite difficult in a short evolutionary period. So, but nevertheless, we need to be able to revaccinate, if need be, a large number of people fast, and we're talking about 15 million people. So you want to, you ideally want to do that in a couple of weeks, and that's your best protection. Now we're sort of heading that direction, but we're not quite on a war footing for it. Let's put it that way. We're probably 600,000 a day, something like that, which will help. And indeed, if we really went flat out for it, it would probably be good enough. But I'd rather be a bit high.
Well, it does seem to be a threshold around 1 million that we can't seem to sort of burst through with vaccinations, which is a shame. So I wanted to move on to sort of the expansion of state power that's taken place around the pandemic. For example, the NHS is planning to collate around 55 million patient records into a single database, which is to be made available to commercial and academic third parties. I believe you've mentioned this before, and it's not something you're particularly happy about.
No, in fact, I've just finished writing a speech from the German debate for the day after tomorrow on exactly this subject. The every few years, the Whitehall and the National Health, well, the Department of Health in particular, has a sort of adolescent spasm about data. I mean, it's like a teenager with a new iPhone. It's as excited and as incompetent as that. And what they do, they suddenly think, oh gosh, we've got all this data, we can use it to analyze this, that, and the other. Now, truth is, big data has a big reputation, but very often is less effective than people think. But secondly, and in a way more importantly on this is your and my data. And it's very private data. It's more private really than your bank account data. It might include a history of psychiatric illness. It might include a history of sexually transmitted diseases. It might include a pregnancy termination if you're a lady. It might include a drug habit. It might include treatment for alcoholism. I mean, I can keep going, but all of these things would be at least embarrassing, and in some cases having terrible family or career consequences if they became public. And it's not impossible. Data breaches happen to the Pentagon. They happen to the US Department of Defense. They happen to Microsoft. So what chance the National Health Service or the Department of Health, who are possibly the world champions in IT incompetence? I mean, they've bear in mind, not that long, it's I think about 10 years since they had to write off 20 billion pounds that they'd invested in a data gathering service in those days, which just collapsed. So there's a real problem here. And I think actually the irony of this is that there are quite a lot, not quite a lot, there's at least one major piece of software which will allow you to do probably 75, 80% of the things you want to do in terms of virtual experiments without the researcher seeing the database. What it does is, if you like, you think of it as a sort of virtual black box. It goes in, it tests your hypothesis, it runs your correlation, it comes back with the regression analysis, it comes back with the graph between the two variables you want, it identifies the number of people suffering from this condition which previously had this, all the things you would normally do. And this is doable now with existing software. And yet that's not what we're being talked about, Why? Because some commercial concern has persuaded some naive person in the Department of Health, oh, well, if we can test our AI on this system, or if we can run our software against it, it will lead to the cure for cancer. Well, that's not going to happen. So what I think is likely to happen is this time around, we will get a proper use of NHS data, which is fine, but I'm going to insist that everybody has an opt-out, a proper and easy to operate opt-out, and that the data, if it's handed over to outsiders, that's very transparent. You know who's being given it or who's been sold it, the access to it, not the actual data, and how it's being used. And on that condition and only that condition, I think there might be a viable option. But remember, when they had care.data, 2 million people opted out before they had to cancel it. And this time it'll be more. It'll be 6 or 7 million if they're not careful. So they've got to get it right.
So I kind of wanted to flow from that into the online safety bill. You're on the subject of sort of eroding civil liberties. It's our view that the online safety bill represents, or at least empowers the state to instruct search engines and social media platforms to censor legal but harmful online speech, which would be defined by whichever government is currently in power, which we think would be a huge erosion of civil liberties. Do you see it the same way?
Yeah, broadly. I mean, it's not directly the state. The irony is, it's Silicon Valley who's going to be the new censor, And what's going to happen is they're going to be. They're going to be required to enforce legal standards. Fine, that's okay. I don't mind that. If somebody's going to break the law online, then shut them down. But what they're talking about is a sort of duty of care, which may be appropriate if you're running a nursing home, but it's not appropriate if you are running a space in which other people are speaking. And the idea is that you should, not you, the Silicon Valley or the provider company, should censor anything which is legal but harmful. Well, how the hell do you define that? Well, what they're being told is that if they get it wrong, they're going to have a huge prospectively billions of pounds fine run by Ofcom. And of course, the head of Ofcom will be appointed by the government of the day. So any company is going to take one look at this person and say, right, what's he going to do if we censor this or censor that? And so they're going to lean over backwards to shut down free speech, which is, frankly, it's a bloody disgrace, is what it is. I can't really put it any softer than that, I'm afraid. And the difficulty is already it's happening. I mean, Facebook blocked a story put on its front page, I think, about Hunter Biden by the New York Post. Right, and that's before we have this sort of thing. They're already doing this. I talked to somebody yesterday whose YouTube account had been shut down and now has been demonetized. And what was it? What was his crime? His crime was to be a lockdown skeptic and put online his statistical analysis, which makes him think that lockdown doesn't work. Well, it's an argument the Swedish government might put up 6 months ago, and yet he's been shut down. So if they're going to do it now, what on earth is it going to be like when they have a threat of a $10 billion fine for not doing it? So free speech is going to go out the window, and by the way, it's not just free speech on one side. We tend to think amongst ourselves that it's the left that maneuver to repress us. It goes both ways. It does go both ways, and everybody out of power anyway will regret it.
Of course. I broadly agree, but I don't think we can deny that online safety is a problem. But if it's not for the state or these large companies to decide as to what should or shouldn't be censored, is there a sort of a pragmatic solution to dealing with the issue of online safety?
Well, first thing to say is there are a lot of sins, and trying to pass one law to calm 1,000 sins won't work. But what I would do, I mean, my instinct at the moment is one of the big sources of all these problems is the presumption of anonymity online. Now, I'm probably the country's biggest privacy campaigner, so you might be surprised, but I think that the presumption of anonymity has become corrosive. We know that anonymous social network members, anonymous ones, are more sexist, more racist, more aggressive, more discourteous, more prone to fake news, and of course easy to forge. You can create bogus accounts in anonymous names, in non-names, by the thousands or the hundreds of thousands. And so I would make a presumption of identity. Now, you can't do it completely because, if you're an opposition politician in Egypt or some other country with not quite our standards and values, then that would be dangerous. And even in the UK or in a sort of liberal democracy, there will be people who are whistleblowers. So you've got to allow the possibility of anonymity, but I'd look quite hard at the sort of general presumption at the moment. And what I would certainly do, almost without question, what I would certainly do is allow people, in fact, require providers to allow people to say, I don't want to hear from any anonymous commentator, any troll, basically. I don't want to hear from them, because you get a lot of, women MPs, for example, get lots of threats, violence threats, but they're always from anonymous people. So you might just reduce the lynch mob tendency on the internet by doing that, and, when I stand up, when I make a speech, I don't put a mask on, so you don't know who I am. When I come on here, you identify me as who I am. The right to privacy is important, but when you go into a public domain and make a public comment, I think you can't have both. So that might be a more elegant way, because then what would happen is that people would be responsible for their own actions, and if you need to sue somebody or if you need to take action, legal action, you've got the person. So the provider is moved out of the scene. It's actually the individual who's the initiator of the problem that is in, as it were, in the public space. And that might be certainly more in line with a common law approach to it.
Sure. I mean, just to provide a bit of argument against that for a minute, do you think that it's perhaps harder to see the value of anonymity, in the sense that we get all these negative consequences in the forms of trolling? It's just plain for everyone to see, but having the ability to express your opinion free from any sort of judgment, it must also have upsides as well, no?
Well, yeah. I mean, this is why I thought quite a long time about this. And as I said, there are certain groups who I would accept. I mean, if let's say I was a whistleblower working in one of the government departments. I mean, I've dealt with more whistleblowers than probably most people. I would want to be able to say to whoever it was, Twitter or whatever, you may have my name, but nobody else may, and you'd agree the terms before you went on. It's just like, you see in the newspapers, in the letters page, sometimes you see name and address supplied. So the newspaper knows that this is not a bogus source, but for good reason they withhold it, and it may be, well, all sorts of possibilities. But at the end of the day, we're a democracy. Democracies are robust places, and if you're going to make an opinion, you ought to be able to stand behind your opinion. Either that, or you just become a lurker instead and just watch. but the big downsides of what I call the lynch mob tendency is that in itself represses free speech. It terrorizes people. Look, someone like me's got thick skin and broad shoulders. It doesn't bother me. But, threats of sexual assault against female members of parliament, for example, comes out of this. Comes up incredibly frequently by comparison what I would think would be the norm. It's something I'd never heard of before 3 or 4 years ago. So I think it's a balancing act, and we can find a way down the middle. The absolute de minimis position, I think, is that you should be able to say, my Twitter account, my online account, my Facebook account, I don't want to hear from anybody who's anonymous, and it would actually reduce the power of them enormously.
That's certainly an interesting proposal. Actually, I'd not heard that one before. But so the online safety bill might represent a poor solution to a significant problem, but we might consider something like voter ID as a solution seeking to solve a non-existent problem. I know you've had thoughts about voter ID in the past as well. That's almost
exactly as I described it. It's a solution looking for a problem. I mean,
yes,
look, there are some problems with electoral fraud. Most of them hinge around postal votes, not around people turning up. It's quite a brave person who turns up at your local polling station where you might have a local election officer, certainly somebody from the local authority, because the person you're masquerading as may already have voted. And that puts you in an embarrassing position, to say the least, straight away. And generally, it was the old-fashioned approach to this was bring a utility bill. If you need some sort of ID, most of us carry credit cards. I mean, the idea that the state should have a photo ID of you is a sort of form of madness. I mean, again, as I say, it's a solution for a problem. One of the difficulties, I found down the years, is that Whitehall is in love with something it calls identity management.
Oh.
Yeah, exactly. Now, I don't want anybody to manage my identity, thank you very much. I do a bad enough job by myself. I don't want anybody else doing it. And so, but it comes back time and again. It's a bit like the adolescent rush on big data. It's the same thing. And there's a general feeling around Whitehall, if you just know enough, if you've got enough data, it will give you all sorts of answers. Well, frankly, I don't want Whitehall poking its nose into that much of my personal life. The relationship between the state and the citizen is looser in Britain than in any other country in the world. And it's one of the reasons, along with property rights, along with the rule of law, along with democracy, that has differentiated us from almost every other country except the Commonwealth, actually, for a long time. And it's one of the reasons that freedom came here first, that the Industrial Revolution came here first, that the huge scientific discoveries that were disproportionately based in Britain more than anywhere else came here first. All of those things come down to the relation, the innate freedom of British citizens. And one part of that is the state can't follow you everywhere and know what you're doing every minute of the day.
So I wanted to interject here with a question from my boss, Eamon Butler, who asks, in 2008, you famously resigned your parliamentary seat in protest at the erosion of civil liberties in the UK. Are they more or less secure today, do you think?
Well, I'm going to fall back on a boring quote, and that is, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. Yeah? And generally speaking, I think freedom is more at risk when the collectivist parties are in power. At the moment, that's the Labour Party, but whatever it is at any point in time. But they are not exactly safe right now. I mean, COVID has put too many temptations in the way for ministers. Ministers on Whitehall naturally aggrandize power. I'm sorry, but it's a human characteristic. Generally speaking, there's resistance to it. Because the government has managed, well, government and its advisors and the various bits of the British establishment have essentially frightened the public. 70% of them are sort of comfortable with the government being a sort of paternalistic overseer. And that's made it too easy. And of course, that's been worsened by Parliament being crippled. I mean, there's really no other word for it. I mean, Parliament is crippled right now. You go in the House of Commons and you make a. I mean, I went in on the rape statement yesterday. I made a statement which normally would have caused a massive intake of breath. A shocking statement, shocking account of something. Place is nearly empty. What impacts it have? I mean, it's quite important. And this means the pressures on ministers are less. So generally speaking, I'd say it's the collectivists that are the big risk, but every government is a risk.
So I wanted to move on to the second section on the subject of looming paternalism and authoritarianism. How do you think that the pandemic will affect British relations with China?
Ah, gosh. Well, it'll probably make them a bit worse than they are already. There's been a campaign, or a series of campaigns, really. It sort of started with Ian Duncan Smith and Damien Green and Tom Tugendhat and me, maybe one or two others, but that was the core group, which started over the Huawei episode. Do you remember that? A concern
Yes.
over security of our communications with China about to dominate the entire 5G network. Then that moved on to the Uyghurs and what is, well, a totalitarian, let's put it mildly, a totalitarian treatment of the Uyghurs, basically concentration camps and so on, destruction of their culture. Then it moved on to Hong Kong with a breach of the agreements there and the oppression of Hong Kong. And of course, it's all been worsened by the behavior of China over COVID. Now, there's a spectrum of concerns here. At the mild end of the spectrum is the belief that China was slow and covert about telling us about the nature of the problem. That's a certainty. That's the mild end of the spectrum, that's a certainty. The other end of the spectrum is the idea that maybe China made this bug in the laboratory. Nobody, I think, thinks it was a deliberate release, but there was an accidental. Somebody got infected in the laboratory, somebody dropped a test tube, whatever it might be, and it got out. And then they didn't tell us, maybe because they were guilty about that. Now, nobody is necessarily suggesting it was a sort of, I don't know, a militarization of coronavirus. It may well have been, if it happened, it may well have been an attempt to prepare for future infections, which went wrong and created the very thing it was trying to prepare for. But either way, wherever you are on that spectrum, China's in a doghouse over its behavior. Yeah? And it sort of compounded that by the fact that it used its overmighty influence in the World Health Organization to do more covering up. So I think basically there is a suspicion about China in the world at large, which is 100 or 1,000 times greater than it was 2 years ago, for all those reasons.
What do you think the UK's role is in dealing with that then? Do you think we have a sort of a special, I mean, at least in the case of Hong Kong, I think we do have a special commitment that we have to uphold?
Well, we have a special commitment, but we also have a special power. If I may, forgive me if I take a slight 1 minute excursion.
No, please do.
The role of Joe Biden now in the United States, frankly, is to prepare America for a transition. Today, America is the biggest economy in the world, to all intents and purposes, and it's the biggest military power in the world. In a decade's time, neither of those things will be true. They'll be true of China, not of America. And in order to deal with China, there's going to have to be a huge coalition. And the core of it, not all of it by any means, but the core of it's going to be sort of an Anglosphere. It's going to be the old Commonwealth. It's going to be America. It's going to be us, of course. Hopefully, it's going to include India, and it'll almost certainly include Japan and Taiwan and Thailand and the country, and Vietnam, maybe the countries around China. And we are, I mean, people often talk when they're talking privately, not so much publicly, that, you know, China's at a sort of 1930s point. Well, there's some sense in that. And the lesson we should learn from history is that if you've got a potentially mighty military power, which is misbehaving, the time to put your foot down is early, not late. All right. So, for example, with the status of Taiwan, we ought to be putting together a coalition to guarantee Taiwan's security. I mean, the Americans, in effect, do that anyway, but we should be doing something to back it up. We should be making it plainer and plainer and plainer to the Chinese what the terms of engagement with the rest of the world are. And that doesn't mean embargoes. It doesn't mean shutting them down. It doesn't, but it does mean demanding certain standards of behaviour. Now, we won't win all the arguments, but and so we shouldn't set our ambitions too high. We should set our sights high, but not necessarily our expectations. And we have a huge. Let's come back to your question. We have a huge role in that. I mean, the Americans will be seen as the great villain on the other side of this argument. We have. I knew when I was a foreign minister, and again when I was Brexit secretary, the expectation of us in the world at large is higher than you would expect. People expect us to behave properly. They're not entirely. They also expect us to be as tricky as hell. I mean, I find when I go around the Middle East, they think we're still pulling the strings. You know, I sometimes think I wish. You know, but the truth is that people have big expectations of us, and if we are involved in something, it adds. I mean, Douglas heard us talk about punching above our weight. What does that mean? It means that if America does something by itself, there'll be a certain reaction in the world. If you add us and Canada and Australia and India, ideally, as I say, and Japan, each of us add a bit more. And I think of all those, Britain probably adds the biggest lever, which is why the so-called special relationship is a terrible sort of dependency term. But it is why there is that strong relationship, because the Americans know it's to their advantage that we get involved in, let's say, creating the D10 or D11, whatever it is now, in putting together maybe the sort of cyber NATO, which is one of the things that will actually have relevance to China.
Do you think sort of strengthening trade relationships with these sort of old friends and collaborators in the Anglosphere is important as well?
Yeah, it's all part of it. I mean, I often cast, when I was talking about the 1930s example, I mean, it's not just trade relationships with your direct allies that matter. It's also trade relationships with the likes of China. I often think that one of the things that led to the Second War in the Pacific was the Americans went just a step too far in denying Japan access to oil, and that put them in a position where they probably didn't, but they probably thought they had to go to war. And you don't want to do that to your opponents or your rivals, if you like, perhaps a better word. But you want to use trade everywhere. You want to use trade to encourage everybody into a better life, to encourage interdependence. So there's a real price to misbehavior, and you want to encourage it to bond countries together culturally. I'm not a believer in this phrase, cultural appropriation. I think we should all steal each other's culture, and then we'll understand each other better. And trade is the biggest vehicle of that. So it's the single, look, the greatest thing that has happened in the history of the world has happened in the last 30 years. And it's since the Uruguay round, that's 1995, and the World Trade Organization has led to a massive reduction in levies and tariffs around the world, which has lifted 1.5 billion people out of misery and abject poverty. Nothing in the history of the world has been so big. And that was capitalism, and that was global trade. And at the moment, the risk is the next 25 years are going to see a move to mercantilism. And we need to stop that, or at least we need to inhibit it. And we need to make sure that trade is the biggest vehicle for good in our lives.
Oh, here. So trade, very important vehicle for improving relations and lifting people out of poverty. How do you feel about the reduction in the aid budget from 0.7% to 0.5%?
Well, I think there's an unalloyed mistake. I mean, I voted against the increase to 0.7, largely because, firstly, I'm a believer in trade first, and that you need to use that as a vehicle. And I have to tell you, the European Union was a downright disgrace in its attitude to trade with many poor countries, even in North Africa, where it's trying to influence things. But I voted against the 0.7 increase primarily because I thought it would lead to a lot of waste of money, massive waste, because it was such a big increase so quickly. And that doesn't help impoverished people in developing countries if the money is wasted. There was an old, it wasn't joke so much as a sarcastic comment from an LSE professor, which was, aid is taking money from poor people in rich countries and giving it to rich people in poor countries. Now, I think we sort of half solved that problem, but not entirely. But I was against the radical increase, but I was even more against the radical decrease, because what we have done is made a lot of people in very poor countries dependent on us for providing clean water, for providing food when they've got a famine, starvation, for providing medical support, particularly for young mothers and very young, for neonates, young children. And the consequence of the cut is probably at least the deaths of at least 100,000 children, maybe several 100,000, and putting over 1 million at risk. So it seemed to me a morally doubtful decision at the best. And I'm not fussed about whether our aid is, in fact, I don't know enough to know whether our aid should be 0.6, 0.65, 0.7, 0.75. All I know is if I were looking at this from inside DFID, I'd be looking at every project and saying, do we really need to give money to China? No, we don't. Do we need to give money to India? No, we don't. They've got a space program. Do we need to give money to Yemen at the moment? Yes, we absolutely do, because children are dying. Same Ethiopia, the same with the Congo, and so on. So that was my view of it. And there are basically, in my view, two primary functions for aid. There are lots of secondary functions, but there are two primary functions. One is it's very difficult to develop your country if you are incredibly poor. You have no capital base to speak of, no capital generation base to speak of, and in particular, sickness, drought, and famine stop you, as it were, getting off your back. So there's that element. Now you've got to get people to the point where they can make the use of trade, and the other one is emergency support. Those are the two, in my view, the two biggest. Now I'm viewed as quite a hardline conservative on these matters, but that's basically where I see it, and that's the test I would apply. Now there are other issues. I mean, issues like teaching young women in parts of the world where young women don't get an education. I mean, that's important too. But the main functions are as I described.
So do you think the cut was done as a sort of a genuine cost-saving measure, or do you think it was done for sort of more politically expedient reasons?
Well, what I noticed is in that budget, there were no other cuts. None at all, as far as I could tell. And this was 4 billion, which is about 1% of the borrowing, or close to that, 1.5% maybe, but that sort of aim. So frankly, it was not something that was going to turn the economy around, was it? Also, there is a view in the Conservative Party that if you ask the public, do you want to increase spending on aid, or do you want to spend the money on giving tuition to kids who've suffered because of COVID? The answer is going to be give tuition to kids, right? Which is sort of true. But if you ask the public, actually, do you want to spend this money on saving the lives of 100,000 children in wherever, you pick your state, in one of the oppressed or drought-stricken parts of the world, they'll, by 92%, they'll say do the latter, right? And so if it was a political gambit, it was a very ill-judged one. It was a very unsophisticated and not very clever one.
Well, on the subject of political gambits, I'd like to move on to the final section. We'll be focusing on the sort of the Tories' ideological underpinnings and recent decision-making process. I'd like to start with the recent Chesham and Amersham by-election, which resulted in a huge swing and victory for the Lib Dems. There's been an awful lot of armchair analysis, which usually sort of devolves into suggesting that the result proves pet hypotheses correct. Some people have been saying the result is because the constituents hate Brexit, or they hate planning reform, they hate HS2, or they hate Boris Johnson. What's your take on the election result?
Well, first thing to remember is, of course, we won this seat in the general election not very long ago, so it's a distinctly different circumstance in which you have the Lib Dems going flat out and pushing certain issues they thought were critical locally. Now, when I went round, I mean, I remember going down one street and the house numbers were 10A, 10B, 10C, and in the next street I found a house number 13 and a half. You had 12, 13, 13 and a half, and 14. So something funny is going on with planning and house building in that part of the world, and there's clearly a lot of antagonism to that, and then the Liberals played that up. There was also a lot of antagonism to HS2, with which I sympathise. And indeed, Cheryl Gillen, who was the MP who died, and an old friend of mine, was the champion against HS2. So those two things obviously had an effect. The third thing, I think, and I wouldn't go so far as to say this was the swing factor at all. I think it was a mixture of things. But I think the 0.7% and things like it had an effect. I mean, ever since Theresa May coined the phrase nasty party, we've been worrying about being seen as the nasty party. But I think a few things, that some of the lockdown decisions, a mixture of things have as it were, loosened the attachment of some previous small L Liberal Tories to the Tory party, and that's what the Lib Dems hoovered up. So it's a mixture of all three, and we ought to pay attention. We shouldn't panic about it. I mean, this is a midterm, and my hunch at the moment, and you can prove me wrong in the next couple of days, is it will probably win Batley and Spen.
I would have made the same bet, yes.
Yeah, but for almost very equally idiosyncratic reasons, in a way. But so we shouldn't be complacent about it. We should think about it hard. And on something like planning, we have got a problem to solve, and the problem is that your generation, is generation rent. it can't. I mean, when I was your age, I was beavering away paying off my first mortgage, and that's only true about 30% now of something like that of your generation. Now it was
It's around that,
65% of mine. So we have to provide some new houses. I mean, the population's gone up by 6 million in the last decade. But maybe the way we're doing it's wrong. Maybe we should be, building garden villages and garden towns, sort of bypassing the existing planning system, which is after all driving prices up. By finding parts of the country where we could actually create towns and villages with houses that are not shoeboxes, which is what most modern houses are, which are actually reasonably priced because we buy up all the farmland at maybe half the development price rather than the full development price. Things like that could be done. We need some more imagination in it. If you got in a helicopter and flew from London to Glasgow, most of it's like flying over a golf course. So then there are lots of places where we could do this. So I think that we just got to start solving the problems a little bit more imaginatively than we have so far, and that's what the next stage of running the country is about. That's when we get through July, and all right, we'll still have some management of the health service and so on to do. But when we get through July, this is where we should be thinking, what are we going to do on this? What are we going to do on housing policy? What are we going to do on science policy? How are we going to make science superpower real? All those sorts of things. And I'm hoping we're going to have a burst of creativity from organisations like ASI for a start.
Well, I should hope so too. So on building on some of those more golf course-esque areas, how would you suggest connecting those new developments to jobs and amenities that people would want to have?
Well, oddly enough, COVID may have helped us with this, because the first thing you will absolutely need in places that are not actually attached to London or attached to Manchester or attached to Birmingham is top-rate fibre optic networks. And they're dirt cheap to provide. If you're doing it ab initio, I mean, the country with the highest fibre optic network in the world, or the best, I think, is South Korea. One of the reasons is something like 3/4 of the urban housing in South Korea is brand new. So it's quite easy to put a fibre optic network in there, much easier than it is into my farmhouse in East Yorkshire. So you can do things like that. But let me unpack it slightly. Let's imagine we found a place between here and Birmingham. I'd look for somewhere not too far from one of the motorways, not too far from one of the main railway lines, and we bought up 500 acres. And we said we paid the farmer half development price. He'd be a rich man for the rest of his life. He wouldn't have to work. And we used the discrepancy to do three or four things. One, as I said, bigger houses than is typical in a London suburb. Two, properly serviced with road, digital network, ideally a link to a rail line, but not necessarily. You'd have a local school, that's the right size for that. A local shopping centre, that's the right size for that. And if you're close enough to one of the main arteries, north and south, then that will allow people to go to work if they need to 5 days a week, but if they need to 1 day a week. That's that, and we're going to see quite a lot of development of that sort of working pattern now. And I just think that's just a hell of a lot easier than trying to build on to Beaconsfield or build on to Chesham and Amersham.
So while we're on the subject of addressing intergenerational inequality, what do you make of recent rumblings that the pensions triple lock might be re-examined?
Well, I don't think it's going to happen. Let me tell you that. And there is a sort of systemic. Well, there's a set of systemic problems with pensions. Number one, because of a mixture of pension changes that Treasury under various parties have put in place, you can easily pay 100% of your pension contribution in taxes these days. A combination of if you pay more than 40,000 a year into a pension, through to the 55% penalty when you go above the £1 million pension pot, which frankly for my generation is moderately well off. It's a sort of middle class level, but it's not the price of that a doctor would get to or a lawyer would get to, and it's not the price you're going to get to when you get to retirement, because by then that's going to be a pittance. So you've got that issue with private pensions. And on the state pension, well, we made a promise in the general election. The problem here, of course, is the promise never countenanced the fact that you'd have a reduction in wages followed by an increase in wages. So, I could see a very strong argument say, yeah, we'll give you the net increase, not the 1 year to 1 year increase. But my feeling is that the politics will say we won't do it. It'll just carry on as is.
Will incur a huge cost, no?
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, the interesting thing is this will cost completely the same amount as the aid budget cut. It's $4 billion. Okay, if I had my way, I'd put the money in, or at least half the money into recovering the aid budget. But there we are. I mean, that's where it is. But it'll be eye-wateringly expensive. But pensions are. Pensions are eye-wateringly expensive, and we've done Gordon Brown took one of the best private pension systems in the world and essentially set about wrecking it. And I'm afraid the Cameron government made it worse, not better.
Right. Well, I would like to go to Q&A very quickly for the last 5 minutes or so, if you wouldn't mind. So I shall start with a question from Alexis Yanaku. It says, hello, Mr. Davis, and thank you for all your work. When can I expect the Singapore on Thames that I voted for 5 years ago to be implemented? By this, I mean following Patrick Minford's recommendations on low taxes, low regulation, and a freed economy.
Well, I wish tomorrow, but it won't be. What you're going to see is two things which I would hope go in opposite directions. Well, let me deal with low taxes first, because there's a real current issue here. I agree with John Maynard Keynes on one thing, and that is that the economic principles you apply have got to be apposite to the time you're applying them, because what's right in one decade is not right in another one. And one of the big arguments going on at the moment is that the Treasury is saying, well, we've got to pay off the costs of the COVID crisis. That's not possible. The truth is, if we paid it off, you'd all be unemployed. I'd be unemployed. You'd be unemployed. We'd no jobs. We'd have destroyed the economy. So we've got to find a solution to that. Now, my ideal solution to that is you essentially sterilize all the borrowing for that, treat it as a war loan, pay it off over 70 years or more, as we did with World War II, and then come back to balancing the budget on the remainder, as it were. And that's a smart way. And on that basis, the Laffer curve rules. We should be cutting corporation tax. We should be cutting the middle rate of income tax, on the income tax on the middle classes, because they're the productive ones. We should make it easier to become a middle class millionaire. That's the sort of thing we should be looking to do. We should be doing everything possible to encourage new technology to come here. I would be creating 12 British Nobel Prizes every year. Obviously not Nobel Prizes, but given to research in this country, dragging people in. I'd be liberalizing you may be surprised at this, I'd be liberalizing the immigration policy, not for Europe, but for India and Canada or for that matter, Japan and Thailand, for high quality, high caliber people to come here and add to our innovation economy. I wouldn't be particularly worried about driving down the regulatory burden in terms of abolishing regulations. I'd be looking to reduce the rate of change of regulations. Most big companies handle regulations without batting an eyelid. The small companies struggle every time you change the regulations. And I would be looking for stability in that rather than anything else. So that's the way I go. But you're going to need to ask that question to every single Tory speaker you get on, so that they feel the pressure for it actually to happen.
Well, on that subject, I have another question from Shona, which says, stepping back from a moment from the immediacy of COVID-19, what do you have to say about the competence of politicians to lead us in time-dependent crises of this type? What training and evaluation do politicians have to deal with crises, and could they be better qualified?
Of course, we could all be better qualified. I'm unusual in that I am trained as a scientist. Indeed, my intended first career was to be a scientist. I then decided I wasn't good enough to win a Nobel Prize. I thought I'd do something else. Actually, what I decided was there's too much politics in science, which is ironic. Anyway, and watching the decisions over COVID. I mean, Matthew Lesh, one of your senior personnel, when I talked a great deal about a lot of bad decisions early on, because the politicians were not in a position to challenge their advisors because they weren't scientifically trained. I mean, the last time most cabinet ministers, most ministers saw a science textbook was their GCSEs. So it doesn't really well qualify them well to deal with that. So you've got that sort of problem. You've got a problem on another front, which is the numeracy of politicians. And when I was Brexit secretary, I was forever being faced with models, economic models of what Britain would look like once we'd left the European Union. And they were always miserably depressive, and that's because they were just rubbish. They were wrong. They used to come to me and I'd tear them to bits and they'd take them away and then they'd leak them to press and they'd bring another one. It was just ridiculous. So I think, I'm afraid you get the politicians that you deserve to some extent, because after all, you elect them. But I do think today's politicians, like other ones in history, reflect the educational standards of the society. And I think one of the problems of our society today is we have fairly antiquated approaches to syllabus selection and to the things we teach. Economics, ASI majors in economics. The only bit of economics really that works is Austrian economics, because it's the economics of ideas, of Schumpeter and creative destruction and all of, I can go on ad nauseam, but the not econometrics, So, I would actually have a lot of people who are studying econometrics study something else, mathematics, physics, whatever, something more useful. So, but that's what you get, and the only constraint you have on the competence of politicians is elections, Democracies are self-correcting systems, thank God.
I just want to ask you if you knew about the Elizabethan order. It's some proposals by our friends Anton Breach and Ned Donovan wrote a paper effectively calling for a sort of a new form of the Nobel Prize, but for British entrepreneurs and innovators.
No, I hadn't, but it sort of parallels something I suggested to the Prime Minister. Look, my comment to you earlier about the next 25 years of mercantilism, I would rather not see, but I think we have to be prepared for. And we have to recognize that nation states don't obey rules very well. So, for example, the French are all the time trying to attract our highest paid people. They basically give them tax-free periods of up to 10 years. And one multi-millionaire I know, now living in Paris, would much rather live in London, but he's living in Paris because he's got 10 years tax-free. That's lots of millions of pounds. And he also has the phone number of the head of the finance ministry, just in case anything goes wrong. So what you find is a lot of bankers now are living in Paris and the balance sheets are in Frankfurt. Now, they all cheat. Now, to come back to your question about the Elizabethan order, I think one way we can cheat is by using the fact that we are seen as world-class scientists. This is a fantastic place to study science and to help turn it into worthwhile value increasing activity. We aren't very good at the second bit of it, or we aren't as good as we should be. We're better than people think. I mean, we created ARM, for example. Don't forget that. We created sizable software operations and so on. We're not as good as Israel. We're not as good as Singapore. We've got some lessons to learn. But we perhaps should start by attracting all the best people we possibly can to come here and build their scientific and commercial empires here. And that's my way of cheating.
Well, David, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a really interesting conversation. I've really enjoyed it. I will say to the audience, don't forget to join us next week, where we'll be joined by Tyler Goodspeed of the Hoover Institution. He'll be talking to our very own Matthew Kilcoyne and Matthew Lesh. David, thank you again. Take care. Have a good evening.
My pleasure. And you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.